In the year 1842, deep within the heart of Georgia's sprawling cotton empire, there lived a woman who commanded her vast plantation with the authority of royalty, though she wore no crown and answered to no king. Her name was Elellanena Whitfield, and the land she controlled stretched so far across the horizon that the eye could not see where her domain ended. Endless rows upon rows of white cotton balls shimmering and dancing under the relentless southern sun. But hidden beneath the facade of those imposing white columns that held up her grand mansion, concealed behind the practiced smiles she wore to church each Sunday, Elellanena harbored an idea so dangerous and twisted that it would forever stain her family's name and curse their legacy for generations to come. When her husband, Thomas Whitfield, succumbed suddenly to a violent fever that no doctor could cure, Elellanena found herself the sole inheritor of an empire that most men would have struggled to manage. Everything became hers in an instant. The thousands of acres of fertile land, the considerable fortune accumulated over decades, and more than 200 enslaved human souls who toiled from sunrise to sunset to maintain the Whitfield wealth. The neighboring plantation owners whispered behind their hands and shook their heads in disapproval, muttering that no woman, regardless of her education or breeding, possessed the strength or wisdom necessary to run such a vast and complex estate without a man to guide her decisions. But Elellanena paid their whispers no mind whatsoever. She held a belief deep in her heart, one that had taken root long before her husband's death, that the Whitfield family was destined for a greatness that exceeded anything their neighbors could imagine. She believed with absolute certainty that their bloodline was superior, purer, stronger, and chosen by divine providence for a special purpose. And she made it her sacred mission to preserve and enhance that power, even if accomplishing her goal meant violating every law of nature, breaking every moral code, and defying every principle of human decency. Night after night, when the house had fallen silent and the servants had retreated to their quarters, Elellanena would sit alone in her late husband's study, surrounded by the remnants of his life. She would light the oil lamps and spend hours poring over his meticulously kept ledgers, studying the careful records of crops and profits and property. On the wall hung a portrait of her 5 daughters, the paint cracked with age, but the images of their faces still clear. Each girl was undeniably beautiful in her own way, tall and graceful with the pale complexion that Southern society prized so highly. But as Elellanena studied their painted faces night after night, she became convinced that something essential was missing from them. She would whisper to herself in the flickering lamplight, her voice barely audible in the empty room, that, yes, they had inherited her grace and refinement, her elegance and bearing, but they lacked entirely what she considered to be their father's strength. To Elellanenna's twisted mind, strength was not simply a matter of physical power or even mental fortitude. Strength meant control over others, the ability to dominate and command, to bend the world to one's will without hesitation or mercy. And as the months passed following her husband's death, she became increasingly obsessed with finding some way, anyway, to improve and strengthen her bloodline, to create something that would endure long after she had turned to dust. Life on the Whitfield plantation operated with the precision of a finely crafted clock, at least on the surface where appearances mattered most. The enslaved workers rose before the sun had painted the sky with color and labored in the fields until the cicadas fell silent at dusk and the stars emerged overhead. The overseers, rough men hired for their willingness to use the whip, shouted commands that echoed across the cotton fields, while the mechanical clatter of the cotton gins filled the air from morning until night. Through it all, Elellanena watched from her second-story balcony, standing as still and cold as a marble statue, her eyes missing nothing that occurred on her land. Among the more than 200 souls she claimed to own, there was one man who stood apart from all the others, a man whose very presence seemed to command attention despite his enslaved status. His name was Josiah, and he was taller than any other man on the plantation, with broad shoulders that spoke of immense strength and a demeanor of calm silence that set him apart. He carried himself with a dignity that seemed almost impossible given his circumstances. Josiah had been sold away from Virginia several years earlier, torn from whatever family and life he had known there, and brought to Georgia in chains. He had received just enough education to read the Bible, a fact that made him unusual among the enslaved population. and he was known throughout the plantation for possessing a strange, unsettling calm, the kind of profound inner peace that made the overseers nervous and uncomfortable in his presence. When Elellanena first truly noticed Josiah, it was not because she felt any stirring of desire or even a flicker of human pity for his situation. What drew her attention was cold, calculated observation. She saw in him a possibility, a potential tool to be used in her grand design. She said nothing to anyone that first day, made no comment or inquiry, but her eyes lingered on him far longer than propriety would have allowed, and that single extended gaze did not go unnoticed. That very night, as the household settled into sleep, the servants who worked in the main house began to whisper among themselves in the darkness. An old woman named Ruth, who had served the Whitfield family for more years than anyone could remember, remarked in a low voice that she had seen the mistress asking questions about that tall one, the man called Josiah. Another servant shook her head slowly and said with the weight of bitter experience that nothing good ever came when a white lady stared too long at one of them. But despite the warnings implicit in these whispered conversations, the rumors did not stop spreading. They grew and multiplied like weeds in fertile soil. By the time the next month had passed, Elellanena had issued orders to the overseer to move Josiah closer to the main house, to assign him lighter work that would keep him near where she could observe him, to bring him into her sphere of influence. When questioned about this unusual decision, she explained smoothly that it was because he was more reliable than the others, more trustworthy and capable. But everyone who lived and worked on the Whitfield plantation understood one fundamental truth. Nothing that Elellanena Whitfield ever did was without careful reason and deliberate purpose. Late one evening, when the entire house had fallen into the deep silence that comes after midnight, Elellanena stood before her dressing mirror in her bedchamber, studying her reflection with critical eyes. The candlelight flickered and danced across her face, revealing what the bright light of day might have hidden, that her once celebrated youthful beauty was beginning to fade, the first fine lines appearing at the corners of her eyes, the first subtle sagging beneath her chin. Her eldest daughter, Marianne, would soon celebrate her 17th birthday, reaching the same age that Elellanena herself had been when she first married Thomas Whitfield, and began what she had believed would be a glorious dynasty. Standing there in the candlelight, staring at her aging reflection, Elellanena whispered to herself with fierce determination that the Whitfield name must not be allowed to fade into obscurity, that she would build a stronger bloodline, a perfect lineage that would last for generations. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch the portrait of her late husband that hung on the wall, tracing the outline of his painted face with something approaching tenderness mixed with resentment. In a voice barely above a whisper, she murmured that he had failed her in the most important way possible, that he had failed to give her a son to carry on the family name, but that she would finish what he had started. She would complete the work he had left undone. The plan forming in her mind was dark beyond description, forbidden by every law of God and man, and utterly unholy in its conception. The next morning dawned bright and hot, and Josiah received orders to present himself at the main house. He stood in the grand entrance hall before Elellanena, his skin still glistening with sweat from a long morning of hard labor in the fields under the unforgiving sun. She looked him up and down with quiet, intense scrutiny, her eyes measuring and calculating, seeing him not as a human being, but as something else entirely, a means to an end. Then she spoke with deliberate simplicity, informing him that from that day forward he would be working under her direct and personal supervision, that the overseer would report any matters concerning him directly to her. Josiah nodded in acknowledgement, but offered no words in response. Behind his outwardly calm eyes, something flickered for just a moment, perhaps suspicion of her true motives, perhaps fear of what was to come. It was impossible to say with certainty. Outside the grand house, the wind swept endlessly through the vast cotton fields, carrying with it whispers and rumors that the thick walls could not contain. The servants who worked in the house and those who labored in the fields began to talk more openly now, and the overseer found himself unable to meet the mistress's gaze when their paths crossed, because everyone who lived on the Whitfield plantation, from the oldest house servant to the youngest field hand, knew one thing with absolute certainty. When Elellanena Whitfield set her mind upon achieving something, she never stopped pursuing it, never relented or showed mercy, not until she had obtained exactly what she desired. Regardless of the cost to others, the summer of 1843 arrived and brought with it heat that was more oppressive than anyone could remember experiencing in recent years. The very air itself felt heavy and thick, difficult to breathe, as if the atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible to come. On a morning when the humidity made every surface damp to the touch, Elellanena summoned Josiah to the wide veranda that wrapped around the front of the main house. She sat in her tall, high-backed chair like a queen upon a throne, moving a delicate lace fan slowly back and forth before her face, while her 5 daughters watched the scene unfold from their concealed positions behind the parlor curtains. She began by confirming his identity, asking if he was indeed the one called Josiah. When he answered in the affirmative, addressing her as custom required, she continued by saying she had heard reports that he was strong and obedient, capable of performing hard work without complaint or rebellion. He nodded once in acknowledgement of this assessment. Then she leaned forward slightly in her chair, and her voice took on a sharp quality, even as she maintained a veneer of calm composure. She informed him that beginning that very day, he would be assigned to work in close proximity to the house rather than in the distant fields. That she would have specific tasks for him to complete personally, and that he would perform these duties exactly as she instructed without question or deviation. To anyone who might have been listening to this exchange from a distance, it would have sounded very much like a promotion, an elevation in status that many enslaved workers would have welcomed as an improvement in their circumstances. But to Josiah, standing there before the mistress, with his eyes properly lowered in the expected posture of submission, her words felt instead like a warning of danger ahead, a premonition that his life was about to become far more complicated and perilous than it had been before. That night, as the cicadas filled the darkness with their deafening chorus of sound emanating from the fields, Josiah sat on the ground outside the small, cramped cabin that he shared with 3 other men. He had never been one to speak much, preferring to keep his thoughts to himself, but the others who lived with him noticed that his usual silence had transformed into something heavier, more ominous, weighted with worry. Ruth, the elderly woman who had served in the main house for most of her life, came by his cabin carrying a wooden bowl filled with thin stew. She leaned close to him and whispered urgently that word had spread among the servants that the mistress had special plans for him, and she warned him in the strongest terms to be careful and watchful, because there was no safety to be found in a white woman's favor. Only danger disguised as privilege. Josiah said nothing in response to her warning, but inside his mind, memory stirred of his previous life in Virginia, of the time before he had been sold and transported to Georgia. He remembered with painful clarity the day he had been separated from his wife and the small child they had brought into the world together, torn away from them and sold to pay someone else's debts. On that terrible day, he had made a solemn vow to himself that he would never again allow himself to be used as a tool for someone else's purposes, that he would preserve whatever dignity and autonomy he could manage despite the chains that bound him. Yet here he found himself once more chosen and singled out, not because anyone wished to show him kindness or grant him any genuine favor, but for some purpose he did not yet fully understand, though he sensed it was something dark and wrong. The following week brought new assignments, and Elellanena ordered Josiah to repair damaged sections of the roof near the parlor of the main house. From her private balcony on the 2nd floor, she stood and watched as he climbed the ladder and began his work, the sweat glistening on his bare back as the merciless sun beat down upon him. Her eldest daughter, Mary Ann, approached and stood beside her mother, finally working up the courage to ask why she was spending so much time watching this particular man work. Elellanena did not turn her head to look at her daughter when she answered, her eyes remaining fixed on Josiah as she explained that a mother must choose very carefully in all things, that the future security and prosperity of their household depended upon strength rather than softness or sentimentality. Mary Ann felt her face tighten with tension and her stomach turn with unease. She did not yet fully understand the complete scope of what her mother intended, but something in her mother's tone of voice, something in the way she spoke those words, sent a chill running down her spine despite the oppressive heat of the day. That very night, unable to sleep, Marianne found herself lying awake in her bed when she overheard the servants whispering to each other in hushed, frightened voices as they moved through the darkened hallways of the house. She strained her ears to catch fragments of their conversation, and as the pieces came together in her mind, as she began to realize what her mother's true plan actually entailed, sleep became utterly impossible. She lay there in the darkness with her eyes wide open, her heart pounding with horror at the implications of what she had learned. A week later, Elellanena gave Josiah orders that surprised everyone in the household. She commanded him to serve wine at the family dinner that evening, a task that was highly unusual and broke with all established protocols and customs. The 5 daughters sat around the dinner table in uncomfortable silence while their mother's eyes lingered on Josiah for far too long, following his every movement with an intensity that made everyone present deeply uncomfortable. At one point, Elena spoke aloud, commenting in a voice meant to be heard by all present about his strong hands, hands that she suggested could shape destiny itself if properly directed. Marianne's shock at hearing her mother speak such words caused her to drop her spoon, which clattered loudly against her plate. The youngest daughter, Clara, stared at her mother with wide, frightened eyes, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. After the meal concluded and the dishes were cleared away, Elellanena dismissed everyone from the dining room except for Josiah. The hallway outside fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. The daughters, unable to resist their curiosity and concern despite knowing they should not eavesdrop, positioned themselves on the stairs where they could listen. They heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, then the creak of a heavy door closing, and then absolutely nothing more. Just silence that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. From that night onward, Josiah became like a shadow that haunted the main house, constantly present but rarely acknowledged directly. He was assigned to fix broken doors, to carry loads of firewood for the many fireplaces, to repair damaged walls, and perform countless other tasks, always keeping him close to the main house, always within sight of the mistress, never allowed to stray far from her sphere of observation and control. The daughters stopped engaging in conversation during dinner, the meals passing in tense, uncomfortable silence. The servants who worked in the kitchen ceased their usual laughter and cheerful banter, going about their work with grim expressions. Even the overseer, a hard man who had never shown fear of much, began avoiding the veranda and finding excuses not to enter the main house when he knew the mistress was present. Every single night, without fail, Elellanena would seat herself in her late husband's favorite leather chair in his study, and she would spend hours writing in a black leather-bound journal that she kept locked in a drawer when she was not using it. On one particular page, written in her neat, perfect handwriting that revealed her excellent education, she had composed the words, "The new Whitfield bloodline will rise from a foundation of strength. My daughters will bear greatness into this world." One night, Josiah finally gathered the courage to attempt to speak to her about what was happening, to voice his concerns about the path she seemed determined to follow. He approached her respectfully and said with careful politeness that he meant no disrespect whatsoever, but that whatever she was asking of him, whatever she intended to demand, it was not right and could not lead to anything good. Elellena's face, which had been showing something almost like friendliness, hardened instantly into an expression of cold fury. She declared in a voice that left no room for argument that he would do exactly as she commanded, that he owed his very life to the Whitfield household, that he belonged to it completely and utterly, every part of him, body and soul. In that moment, Josiah looked directly at her, meeting her eyes in a way that enslaved people were strictly forbidden from doing with white people. But he looked at her not as a slave cowering before his owner, but as a man who had been stripped of everything he valued except for his fundamental will to remain human. He said quietly but firmly that no, she was wrong, because no one, regardless of their power or wealth, could own another person's soul. That single sentence hung suspended in the air between them like the rumble of approaching thunder, heavy with implications and consequences. From that night forward, Elellanena watched Josiah with different eyes, no longer observing him with curious interest or calculating assessment, but with pure, undisguised fury that he had dared to assert his humanity in her presence. The very next morning, she summoned the overseer and ordered him to keep Josiah under much closer observation and control, though by then the whispers and rumors about the situation had already begun spreading far beyond the boundaries of the Whitfield estate, traveling from plantation to plantation across the county. People spoke in scandalized undertones about a widow, an enslaved man, and a plan so profoundly unnatural and perverse that even the other plantation owners, who had their own dark secrets and shameful practices, pretended not to know anything about it when asked. By the time that brutal summer finally drew to a close, every single soul living and working on the Whitfield estate, from the newest field hand to the oldest house servant, knew with absolute certainty that something terrible was approaching. That a storm was gathering that would eventually break over them all with destructive force. The summer sun began its seasonal descent earlier each evening, and the plantation, which had never been a cheerful place, seemed quieter than anyone could remember it ever being before. Yet beneath that deceptive surface of silence and calm, something dark and rotting was spreading through the foundation of the Whitfield household like decay under polished wood, invisible from the outside but devastating in its effects. Elellanena Whitfield's eyes had lost whatever small measure of warmth they might once have contained, if indeed they had ever possessed any warmth at all. Every word that emerged from her mouth now carried significant weight and implied threat. Every decision she made seemed coldly calculated and measured for maximum effect on her ultimate goals. Every glance she directed toward Josiah was heavy with dark intent and unspoken demands. The servants spoke less and less, keeping their words to the bare minimum necessary to perform their duties. The daughters actively avoided meeting their mother's gaze whenever possible, finding excuses to be elsewhere when she entered a room. Even the physical structure of the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Marianne, as the eldest of the daughters, was the only one who possessed the courage to question her mother's increasingly disturbing behavior, though doing so required her to overcome tremendous fear. She had begun to sense with growing certainty what her mother was planning, what twisted scheme was taking shape in that brilliant but corrupted mind, and the thought of it made her physically sick with dread and horror. One night, as candles flickered in the drawing room and cast dancing shadows across the walls, Marianne tried to speak to her mother about the situation. She began softly and carefully, saying that the things her mother was asking of Josiah and implicitly of her daughters as well were simply not right, that they violated fundamental principles of decency and morality. Elellanena did not even bother to look up from the correspondence she was writing at her desk. Her pen continued to move steadily across the paper, her handwriting remaining perfectly controlled as she responded in a cold, dismissive tone. She explained to her daughter that what was truly right and proper was whatever served to preserve the Whitfield name and reputation, whatever kept their bloodline strong and pure and dominant. Marianne took a hesitant step closer to her mother's desk and pressed the issue, asking in a voice that trembled slightly what cost was acceptable for achieving these goals, what price was too high to pay. That question finally made Elellanena pause in her writing. She turned in her chair to face her daughter directly, her pale face seeming to glow with an almost supernatural quality in the candlelight. She declared without any hint of doubt or hesitation that any cost was acceptable, that the world ruthlessly took whatever it wanted from those who were weak, and she absolutely would not tolerate weakness in her household under any circumstances. Marianne felt her throat tighten with fear as she realized something profound and terrible. For the first time in her entire life, she was genuinely afraid of her own mother, afraid of what this woman who had given birth to her and raised her might be capable of doing. The next morning arrived with its usual oppressive humidity, and Elellanena summoned all 5 of her daughters to gather in the parlor. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to draw full breath, while the cloying scent of magnolia flowers growing just outside seeped in through the open doors and windows. Josiah stood silently near the veranda just outside, his eyes properly lowered toward the ground as expected, but his mind was elsewhere, racing through possibilities and outcomes. Elellanena began her address to her daughters by calling them her dears and telling them that they represented her pride and her life's entire purpose for existing. But she continued by explaining that their family must endure and prosper long after she herself had died and been laid in the ground. They needed to understand, she insisted, that they were chosen by forces beyond their understanding for something greater and more important than ordinary people could ever achieve. Something that the conventional world would never be able to comprehend or appreciate. Her second daughter, Louise, spoke up nervously, saying that people in the community were already talking about the family, that the preacher's wife had been making comments and spreading gossip. Elellena's voice suddenly snapped out like the crack of a whip, sharp and vicious, cutting her daughter off mid-sentence. She proclaimed that the preacher's wife was a fool and an ignorant woman, that people could talk all they wanted because their opinions meant nothing, that these small-minded neighbors knew absolutely nothing about destiny or divine purpose. The younger daughters exchanged frightened glances with each other, faces pale with worry. They had always obeyed their mother without question throughout their lives, had always believed that she possessed wisdom and knew what was best for the family. But now, even these young and sheltered girls could see something in their mother's eyes that no longer resembled faith or religious conviction. What they saw instead looked disturbingly like madness, like someone whose grip on reality had begun to slip away. That night, sleep proved impossible for the eldest daughters. Marianne sat positioned at her bedroom window, staring out into the darkness that blanketed the fields, listening to the endless chorus of cicadas filling the night air with their mechanical song. In the moonlight that filtered through thin clouds, she could see Josiah's figure walking alone across the grounds, his silhouette outlined clearly against the lighter sky. When the main house had finally fallen completely quiet and she was reasonably certain everyone else had gone to sleep, she made a bold decision. She crept down the stairs as quietly as possible, avoiding the steps that she knew would creak and give her away. Outside, the night air was heavy and alive with the sounds of countless insects and night creatures going about their business. She called out his name in the softest whisper she could manage while still being audible. Josiah stopped walking, but did not immediately turn to face her. Marianne spoke in a voice that trembled with emotion, telling him that her mother was not well, that something fundamental had broken inside her mind, that she was losing herself to this obsession. Josiah turned then and looked at her directly, his face maintaining its characteristic calm expression, but his eyes were filled with something deep and weary, the exhaustion of someone who has carried an impossible burden for far too long. He replied simply that he knew this already, that it was obvious to anyone paying attention, but that Elellanena would not stop pursuing her twisted goals until someone or something forced her to stop. Marian's eyes filled with tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks as she said in a voice choked with emotion that if this situation continued on its current path, her mother would destroy absolutely everyone involved, every member of the family, and everyone connected to them. From that night forward, Marianne made every effort to avoid her mother whenever possible, but Elellanena was far too observant and cunning to miss such obvious behavior. The widow had become sharper and more perceptive, if anything, more cruel in her manipulations, more suspicious of everyone around her. She began implementing new rules to keep her daughters close to her at all times, never allowing them to walk anywhere alone, never permitting them to have private conversations that she could not overhear. Every single decision she made now centered around maintaining absolute control over every person in her household. She summoned a seamstress and had all the girls measured for new dresses, specifying that they should all be white and all made in matching styles. When asked about the occasion for such formal attire, she claimed it was necessary for a family portrait she intended to have painted, but none of her daughters believed this explanation for a moment. And Josiah found himself trapped between two completely incompatible worlds, watched constantly by the overseer and other eyes loyal to the mistress, ordered to work exclusively in areas near the main house where his activities could be monitored at all times. He understood with terrible clarity that escape had become functionally impossible, now that Elellanena had made him the absolute center of her twisted vision for the future, the keystone upon which her entire mad plan depended. One evening, As the sky transformed into a deep, rich orange color that promised another sweltering day to follow, Elellanena called Marianne into the study for a private conversation. On the heavy wooden desk lay her black leather journal, its pages filled with her neat, controlled handwriting. She commanded her daughter simply and directly to read what she had written there. Marianne hesitated, her hand hovering over the journal, knowing instinctively that once she read its contents, there would be no going back to innocence or ignorance. Finally, she opened the book and let her eyes scan the pages. The words written there seemed to stare back at her with malevolent intent. A new bloodline must begin. My daughters shall be the vessels that carry it forward. Josiah will serve as the instrument of renewal, the means by which strength enters our line. Marianne's hands began to shake so violently that she nearly dropped the journal. She looked up at her mother with an expression of pure horror and disbelief, saying that surely this could not be what she actually meant, that she could not seriously intend to go through with such a plan. Elellanena stood up from her chair with deliberate slowness, her face remaining completely pale and cold, showing no emotion whatsoever. She spoke quietly but with absolute finality, informing her daughter that events had already been set in motion, that it was too late to turn back now, that the Whitfield family would not be forgotten or allowed to fade into historical obscurity. Marianne backed away from her mother as if from a dangerous animal, her voice breaking with emotion as she accused her mother of destroying the family rather than saving it. But Elellanena''s expression did not change in the slightest, remaining as fixed and immovable as stone. She replied in that same quiet, certain tone that no, her daughter was wrong in her assessment because she was not destroying anything but rather saving them all from weakness and eventual extinction. When Marianne could bear no more and fled from the study, she ran with tears streaming down her face directly to the servants' quarters, desperately seeking someone, anyone, who might understand and help. She found Ruth, the old woman who had served the family for decades, and whispered to her through her tears that her mother had truly gone mad, that she intended to use Josiah in the most horrible way imaginable, that she planned to use all of them for her twisted purposes. Ruth placed a trembling hand on the young woman's shoulder, her own eyes filled with sorrow and resignation, and she said softly and gently that the girl had best find some way to escape from this place, because her mother had already sold her soul to the devil himself, and there was no saving someone who had made such a bargain. That particular night brought thunder rolling across the plantation like the drums of war, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets, beating hard against the old white columns that held up the grand facade of the house. Inside that great structure, Elellanena Whitfield sat completely alone at her desk, writing one final entry in her journal, the pen scratching across the paper with steady determination as she formed the words, "The seed has been chosen. The future draws near." The rain that soaked the Whitfield plantation continued falling for 3 full days without pause, turning the roads into rivers of mud and the fields into swamps. When the sun finally emerged again and burned away the clouds, the plantation felt like a fundamentally different place than it had been before the storm. Quiet in an ominous way, heavy with unspoken dread, and irrevocably chained. The workers laboring in the fields spoke only in hushed murmurs when they spoke at all, deeply afraid that their words might somehow travel through the air and reach the mistress's ever-listening ears. The overseer avoided coming anywhere near the main house, claiming to anyone who asked that Miss Whitfield did not need any man to tell her what was right or proper anymore, that she had moved beyond such conventional guidance. But by that point in time, everyone from the youngest child to the oldest elder knew the fundamental truth of the situation. Something was profoundly wrong inside that mansion. Something dark and evil had taken root there. Elellanena Whitfield had stopped attending church services entirely, no longer making even a pretense of conventional piety or religious observance. Her 5 daughters no longer made visits into town for shopping or social calls, effectively cutting themselves off from the outside world. The preacher, concerned about the souls of his flock, came once to the plantation to call on the family and inquire about their well-being. He left looking pale and shaken, walking quickly back to his horse, his Bible clutched tightly against his chest with trembling hands, and he never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed or heard during that visit. And Josiah, the tall man who had become the unwilling center of all these whispers and rumors and terrible speculation, had transformed into something like a ghost, moving through the estate, performing his assigned tasks, but seeming somehow less substantial, less present, as if he was already halfway departed from the physical world. The other men working the plantation showed him quiet respect born of sympathy, while the women looked at him with eyes full of pity for his impossible situation. And the mistress watched him constantly, her gaze following his every movement like a hawk observing its prey. Josiah had learned through bitter experience to keep his eyes lowered at all times when in the presence of white people, to keep his mouth shut except when directly addressed and required to respond, and to keep his true spirit buried so deep inside himself that no one could touch it or damage it further. But despite these protective measures, something was starting to burn inside him, a slow-building fire of resistance and rage that grew hotter with each passing day. One night when moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the main house and illuminated the interior with its pale, ghostly glow, Marianne made a dangerous decision. She slipped as quietly as she possibly could into her mother's study, moving like a shadow, barely daring to breathe. The black leather journal lay open on the desk, almost as if it had been left there deliberately, as if it was waiting specifically for her to find it and read its contents. She approached it with trembling hands and let her eyes scan the most recent entries, words written in that same perfect controlled handwriting that somehow made their terrible content even more disturbing. The latest entry read, "The blood must be mixed according to my design. The bloodline must be renewed and strengthened. I have been chosen by Providence to make this vision reality." Marianne felt the entire room begin to tilt and spin around her as the full implications crashed down upon her consciousness. She pressed her hand firmly over her mouth to physically prevent herself from crying out in horror and alerting the household to her presence. She was so completely absorbed in the journal's terrible revelations that she failed to notice her mother's figure standing motionless in the doorway, watching her with cold calculation. Elellena's voice emerged from the shadows, sharp and cold as a knife blade, accusing her daughter of reading what did not belong to her, of violating her privacy and trust. Marianne spun around, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she feared it might burst from her chest. "Fräulein," she said the only thing that came to her mind, calling what her mother was planning absolute madness, complete insanity. Her mother walked closer with slow, measured steps, the candlelight she carried flickering across her pale face and casting moving shadows that made her look almost demonic. She spoke softly, almost gently, explaining to her daughter that what appeared to her young and inexperienced eyes as madness was actually purpose, divine purpose, and that she was simply too young and naive to understand what it truly meant to build something capable of lasting through the ages. Hahn stepped backward, putting more distance between herself and this woman who suddenly seemed like a stranger wearing her mother's face. She protested desperately that her mother could not use Josiah in this way, that he was a human being created in God's image, not an animal to be bred according to someone's design. Before she could complete her sentence, Elellena's hand struck her hard across the face, the sharp crack of the slap echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. She hissed one word through clenched teeth, "Enough." Then she declared with absolute finality that her daughter would do exactly as she was told, that obedience was not optional. Marianne's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of pain from the physical blow. Rather, they were tears born from the horrifying realization that her mother genuinely, truly believed that she was doing God's work, that she had convinced herself that this abomination was somehow righteous and holy. That very night, driven by desperation and fear, Marianne ran through the darkness to the servant quarters, her nightgown flowing behind her. She found Josiah sitting alone in the dim light, methodically sharpening an old blade that was normally used for cutting sugarcane. She whispered urgently that her mother would not stop, that she had lost her mind completely, that she intended to force this unspeakable abomination upon all of them. Josiah looked up slowly from his work, his movements deliberate and calm despite the tension of the moment. He replied simply that he already knew this, that the situation had been clear to him for some time. Marianne hesitated for just a moment, gathering her courage, before suggesting desperately that they should leave, that they should escape this place, before it was too late. But Josiah shook his head slowly and sadly, explaining to her that they would be hunted, that a man in his position did not simply get to walk away from a plantation and start a new life somewhere else, that the entire system was designed to prevent exactly that kind of escape. When Marianne persisted, saying that if they remained where they were, her mother would destroy everyone, would ruin her sisters, and condemn Josiah to a fate worse than death, he looked at her with an expression of quiet sorrow mixed with grim determination. He said thoughtfully that perhaps it was finally time for someone to stop Elellanena, to stand up and put an end to her mad plans. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither of them spoke another word, the weight of what they were considering pressing down on them. The night around them was thick with the sound of crickets chirping and distant thunder rumbling on the horizon. Then Marianne said very softly, her voice barely audible, that if he tried to resist or stop her mother, Elellanena would have him killed without hesitation or mercy. Josiah gave a faint smile, sad and resigned, but also strangely peaceful, and he replied that this might well be true, but that at least if he died, he would die standing upright like a man rather than on his knees like an animal. The next morning brought new developments as rumors and whispered stories began to spread far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. A trader who regularly did business in the nearby town reported that he had heard strange and disturbing things about the Whitfield widow. That word was spreading that she had lost her senses entirely and was attempting to deliberately mix bloodlines in ways that violated both natural law and divine commandment. Other people whispered in scandalized tones that the entire family must be cursed, that God was punishing them for some terrible sin. Neighboring plantation owners and farmers began deliberately avoiding the road that passed by the Whitfield property, taking longer routes to their destinations rather than risk any encounter or association. Even the young boy who normally delivered mail to all the homes in the area stopped making deliveries to the Whitfield plantation, telling his employer that he felt uncomfortable going there. But Elellanena herself seemed entirely untouched by any shame or social stigma. If anything, she carried herself with even more pride and hauteur than before, her posture more erect, her head held higher. Her hair was always pinned in perfect, elaborate styles without a single strand out of place, and her eyes burned with an intensity that suggested absolute certainty in her chosen path. When one of her daughters broke down crying during the evening supper, unable to contain her distress any longer, Elellanena calmly informed her that tears were for weak people, for those who lacked the strength and conviction to do what was necessary, and that they, the Whitfield women, were chosen for something far greater than ordinary happiness or comfort. That particular night, she gave orders to the servants to prepare the main parlor for what she called a ceremony, though she provided no details about what this ceremony would entail. Candles were lit throughout the room, creating a flickering illumination that seemed more ominous than festive. The heavy curtains were drawn shut, blocking out the last light of the dying day. The 5 daughters were commanded to wear their new white dresses, the ones that had been made to match perfectly. And Josiah received a summons to present himself in the main hall, a summons that he knew he could not refuse no matter how much he might want to. When he entered that hall, the silence that greeted him was absolutely suffocating, so thick and heavy it felt like a physical presence. Elellanena stood positioned before the great ornate door, her daughters arranged in a line behind her. She spoke softly, almost tenderly, saying that the time had finally arrived, that they would proceed with what must be done. But before she could continue speaking and explain exactly what she intended, Marianne took a bold step forward, separating herself from her sisters. From her sisters. Her voice rang out clear and firm despite her terror, declaring that no, this would end tonight, that she would not allow it to continue. The old woman's lips tightened into a thin, hard line, and she told her daughter sharply that she was forgetting her place and her duty. Marianne raised her voice even louder, her hands shaking with the intensity of her emotion, but her words remaining clear and strong. She accused her mother of forgetting God entirely, of abandoning every principle of decency and humanity, of betraying everything that her late father had stood for and believed in. For just a brief moment, Elellanena looked genuinely stunned, as if she had been physically struck. Then her voice transformed, taking on a quality of cold steel as she commanded her daughter to obey her immediately. But Mary Ann stood her ground and refused, saying the single word, "No," with all the conviction she could muster. At that moment, Josiah began to move, his actions slow and deliberate and impossible to misinterpret. He positioned himself physically between the mother and the daughter, placing his body as a barrier between them. His voice emerged low but absolutely firm, carrying a conviction that could not be denied. He stated clearly that this house was not holy, that what was being planned here was not sacred or righteous, and that whatever God Elellanena claimed to serve would not want this abomination to occur. Elellena's hand began to tremble visibly, perhaps with rage or perhaps with the first hint of doubt. Her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out clearly beneath her skin. She demanded to know how he, an enslaved man, dared to speak to her about God or morality or righteousness. But Josiah did not move from his position or lower his gaze. His eyes remained locked directly on hers with an expression of calm but absolute defiance, steady and unwavering in his conviction. Something in that direct look, in that refusal to submit or back down, seemed to break something inside Elellanena. For the first time and longer than anyone could remember, she looked uncertain, almost frightened. The candlelight throughout the room flickered as a breeze moved through the house, and in that brief moment of wavering illumination, the daughters saw clearly the woman who had given birth to them and raised them, no longer the confident and commanding figure she had always been, but someone consumed utterly by her own obsession, hollowed out and possessed by an idea that had grown larger than her humanity. No one in that room moved a muscle. No one dared to breathe or speak. And outside the house, thunder began to roll across the sky once more, growing louder with each passing moment, as if the very heavens themselves were bearing witness to this confrontation and preparing to render judgment. The rain returned that night with even greater force than before, hammering against the old plantation structures like divine wrath, made manifest, battering everything in its path without mercy. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes that illuminated the white columns of the Whitfield mansion, making them seem to glow against the darkness for brief moments before plunging back into shadow. Inside the house, candles still burned from the ceremony that had never been completed, their wax dripping steadily onto the expensive wooden floors, the air thick and choking with smoke and tension and unspoken terror. Josiah stood alone in the hallway outside the parlor, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that he could hear nothing else, could feel nothing but the rapid hammering of his pulse. From upstairs, he could hear Elellena's voice, no longer controlled and measured but low and furious, trembling with something that existed in the space between pure anger and complete madness. She was speaking to herself, or perhaps to God, or perhaps to demons, hissing words about corruption and betrayal. She has corrupted them. My own daughter has turned them all against me, has poisoned their minds against divine purpose. Marianne had been forcibly locked in her bedroom, the key turned from the outside, while her sisters cried quietly behind their own closed doors, not daring to make enough noise to draw their mother's attention, but unable to contain their grief and fear entirely. Josiah understood with terrible, perfect clarity that if he waited until morning to act, if he allowed the night to pass and the sun to rise on another day, someone in this house would die, probably multiple people, and the blood would be on his hands for not acting when he had the chance. He made his decision and moved quickly through the darkened house to the back stairs where the shadows were deepest and thickest. In the servant quarters, a handful of men looked up when he entered their cramped space, and they saw immediately the expression in his eyes, the look of a man who had made an irrevocable decision and would not be turned aside from his chosen path. He whispered just 2 words to them: "Tonight, now." The men hesitated, exchanging glances heavy with fear and uncertainty, because every single one of them knew exactly what the punishment would be if they were caught attempting to run. Knew that it would mean the whip or the noose or worse tortures that plantation owners had devised to make examples of those who dared to seek freedom. But then one of the older women present, her hands permanently scarred and roughened from decades of scrubbing clothes on the washboard, spoke up in a soft but determined voice. She said simply that she would help them, that the Lord had been waiting on this place long enough, that divine patience had reached its limit, and it was time for action. They moved with the practiced stealth of people who had learned to be invisible, silent as ghosts drifting through the night. In the barn, they gathered what meager supplies they could manage to collect without raising suspicion. Some bread that would go stale within days, a ceramic jug filled with water, and an old oil lantern that had barely enough fuel remaining to burn for an hour or two. Josiah approached one of the horses tethered in its stall, using a blade to cut through the rope that secured it, whispering gentle, calming words to the animal to keep it from panicking and alerting anyone to their presence. Meanwhile, in her locked bedroom, Marianne sat positioned at her window, watching the rain streak down the glass in continuous rivulets, each drop chasing the ones that had come before. She heard a faint sound from below, the almost imperceptible creak of the back door being opened slowly and carefully, and her heart suddenly leapt with a wild mixture of hope and terror. She tore desperately at her door's latch, her fingers scrabbling at the metal, whispering urgent prayers under her breath. Please, please don't wake her. Please let this work. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the latch finally gave way with a soft click that sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet house. She ran barefoot down the hallway, her nightgown brushing against the polished wooden floor, moving as quickly as she dared while still trying to remain quiet. Josiah stood waiting at the back door, completely soaked from the rain, holding the flickering lantern in one hand. Their eyes met in the darkness, and entire conversations passed between them without a single word being spoken. He said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain, that she had actually come, expressing something like surprise mixed with relief. She whispered back fiercely that she was not staying in this house another moment, not after everything that had happened, not after what her mother had revealed herself to be. From somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked with the distinctive sound that meant someone was walking across it, putting weight on that particular spot. Then came Elellena's voice, faint at first but growing sharper, calling out with an edge of suspicion. "Marianne, where are you? Answer me this instant." Both Marianne and Josiah froze completely, not even daring to breathe, every muscle tensed. The thunder chose that exact moment to crack directly overhead, so loud and violent that the very foundations of the house seemed to shake. Then Josiah's hand closed around Marianne's wrist with gentle but urgent pressure, and he spoke just one word, "Now." They bolted together out into the storm, running as fast as their legs could carry them. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing in pain, tearing at their clothes and hair. The path beneath their feet had transformed into slick, treacherous mud that tried to pull them down with every step. Behind them, the sound of a window being violently thrown open carried even over the storm, followed immediately by Elellena's scream tearing through the night. "Hi, traitors. Both of you are traitors to your blood." The fury and betrayal in that voice was so intense it seemed to have physical weight, but the thunder swallowed it up almost immediately, and they kept running without looking back. They ran past the endless cotton fields, the wet stalks slapping painfully against their legs and arms, soaking them even more thoroughly than the rain alone could manage. Until finally the main house was nothing more than a distant, dim shape barely visible through the sheets of rain. Josiah did turn once, just briefly, to look back at what they were leaving behind. He saw the Whitfield mansion illuminated in sudden flashes of lightning, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, like something that might not even be real. And in those brief moments of illumination, it looked less like a home than like a monument to pride and madness. But escape, as Josiah had known from the very beginning, was never going to be a simple matter. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Elellanena had ordered the hunting dogs to be released from their kennel. The overseer, his face flushed red with anger and perhaps fear of what the mistress might do to him if he failed, rode out from the plantation, accompanied by 2 other men, all of them armed with rifles. They followed the muddy tracks that Marianne and Josiah had left behind in their desperate flight, the footprints leading clearly toward the dense woods that marked the edge of the cultivated land. Marianne could barely maintain the pace anymore, her feet leaving bloody prints on the ground where branches and stones had cut her skin, her once white nightgown torn into ragged strips and covered in mud and blood. Josiah slowed his own pace just enough to help steady her when she stumbled, supporting her weight partially on his shoulder. He whispered encouragement, telling her they were close now, that there was a river just ahead, and if they could manage to cross that river, they could hide themselves in the cypress swamps on the other side, where the dogs would lose their scent in the water. But they never reached that potential salvation. The hunting dogs, bred and trained specifically for tracking escaped slaves, found them first, their distinctive baying and howling echoing through the forest and announcing to everyone within miles that the prey had been located. Josiah spun around quickly, pulling Marianne down behind the massive trunk of a fallen tree, positioning his body between her and the direction from which the sounds were approaching. Through the trees, still some distance away, but getting closer with every passing second, he could see the flickering orange light of torches moving through the pre-dawn darkness. He called her urgently to stay down, to keep her head below the level of the log, and then, before she could protest or stop him, he was moving. The first gunshot rang out through the forest, the sound sharp and clear even over the residual noise of the dying storm, and the bullet struck a tree trunk only inches from where Josiah's head had been just a moment before, sending splinters of bark flying in all directions. But Josiah did not hesitate or cower. Instead, he lifted a heavy branch that had fallen from the tree, testing its weight and balance, transforming it into an improvised weapon, and he moved deliberately toward the approaching lights and voices. Marianne cried out in desperation, screaming for him not to do this, begging him to come back, but he was already gone, swallowed up by the shadows between the trees. There was more shouting from multiple voices, angry and confused, then another gunshot that seemed even louder than the first, and then a silence that was somehow more terrible than any sound could have been. Marianne waited behind her sheltering log, her entire body trembling uncontrollably, her hands pressed firmly over her mouth to muffle any sound she might make. Minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness, each second feeling like an hour. Then through the trees and the lingering morning mist, she saw a shape moving toward her with an uneven, limping gait. It was Josiah, blood streaming from a wound on his upper arm, his shirt torn nearly completely away from his body, but miraculously, impossibly, still alive and still standing. He collapsed to his knees beside her, his breathing harsh and ragged, struggling to draw air into his lungs. He managed to whisper through his exhaustion and pain that it was done, that he had managed to drive them back or confuse them somehow, but they needed to keep moving immediately because more men would be coming soon, probably many more. They stumbled onward together, supporting each other's weight, until they finally reached the riverbank just as full daylight was breaking across the sky. But the river they had counted on for salvation had transformed into something terrifying during the heavy rains. The water was extraordinarily high, well above its normal level, and moving with violent force, rushing past with a current so strong it carried entire trees and other debris along with it. Marianne stared at this raging torrent with pure terror written across her face, saying in a voice tight with fear that they absolutely could not cross something like that attempting it would be suicide. Josiah stood beside her, staring at the furious water with his jaw set in determination, and he replied with simple finality that they did not have any choice in the matter, that staying on this side meant certain capture and probably death. He took her hand once more in his, gripping it firmly, and together they waded into the freezing water that immediately tried to sweep their feet out from under them. The current pulled viciously at their legs, threatening to drag them downstream and under the surface with every step they took deeper. The rain, which had finally stopped falling from the sky, had left the river transformed into a monster. Behind them, on the bank they had just left, the torches held by their pursuers finally reached the tree line. Breaking through into the open area beside the river, voices shouted commands and questions through the early morning air, trying to spot their quarry in the dim light. Marianne could not help herself. She looked back one final time over her shoulder. In a flash of the rising sun breaking through the clouds, she saw a figure she recognized immediately standing at the very edge of the woods, dressed in a black cloak that whipped and snapped in the wind like the wings of some great dark bird. It was her mother, Elellanena Whitfield, who had apparently followed the pursuit herself rather than waiting at the house for news. The widow did not move from her position or make any attempt to follow them into the water. She simply stood there like a statue carved from pale stone, watching with hollow, empty eyes as her daughter and the man who had defied her waded deeper into the deadly current. Her face held an expression of such profound loss and devastation that, for just a moment, Marianne felt a stab of pity for this woman who had once been her mother. And then, in the combined roar of the raging river and the rumble of thunder still echoing in the distance like the voice of heaven itself passing judgment, both figures vanished completely into the dark churning water, swallowed up as if they had never existed at all. The rain washed away their footprints and any other trace of their passage within hours. By the time that same morning had fully arrived and the sun had climbed higher in the sky, the Whitfield plantation stood wrapped in silence once again. It was a grand house, impressive in its architecture and furnishings, but now it contained no laughter from children playing, no songs from servants going about their work, no prayers being offered up to heaven. There was only one woman sitting utterly alone at an upstairs window, staring fixedly in the direction of the river that had taken from her everything she had tried so desperately to control, everyone she had tried to bend to her will. The storm had finally passed completely by the following morning, leaving behind a sky over Georgia that was uniformly gray and hung low over the land, pressing down like a physical weight. The air itself was thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of wet earth and the acrid scent of ash from lightning-struck trees. The Whitfield plantation stood in an oppressive silence that felt unnatural and wrong. There were no servants moving about in the yard, going about their morning tasks. There was no sound of horses' hooves or wagon wheels on the long drive. There were no voices calling to each other across the distances of the estate. There was only the wind creaking mournfully through the loose shutters and the harsh cries of crows circling overhead, their black shapes moving against the gray sky. Inside the main house, Elellanena Whitfield remained seated at the grand dining table where she had apparently positioned herself at some point during the night and had not moved since. Her hair, usually so meticulously arranged and pinned, hung loose and disordered around her face. Her dress still bore the mud stains from the night before when she had rushed out into the storm. The candles that had been burning throughout the house had long since consumed all their wax and guttered out, leaving behind only long streaks of hardened white wax running down the polished wood surfaces like frozen tears. Her remaining daughters huddled together upstairs in one of the bedrooms, absolutely terrified to venture down to the main floor after having seen their mother's face when she had returned from the river. She had been pale as death itself, her eyes completely empty of any emotion or recognition, her lips moving constantly as she whispered the same words over and over again in an endless loop. "They're gone. They're both gone. Everything is gone." Not one of the remaining family members dared to speak to her or attempt to comfort her or even to enter the same room. The servants who had not fled the plantation during the night stayed completely out of sight, hiding in their quarters and making signs to ward off evil, crossing themselves whenever they heard the mistress's footsteps echoing through the empty halls. By the time dusk arrived and shadows began to lengthen across the land, word of the tragedy had spread to all the neighboring farms and estates. Two men who had been riding along the road paralleling the river reported that they had seen shapes in the water near the bend where the swamp began. What appeared to be a man and a woman being swept along by the still swollen current, their bodies tumbling over and over in the brown water. Despite searches conducted over the following days, their bodies were never recovered from the river, never found washed up on any bank or caught in any tangle of debris. It was as if the river had swallowed them completely and refused to give them back. The preacher who had avoided the Whitfield plantation for weeks finally returned the day after the disappearances, riding his horse slowly up the long drive with his Bible held in his hands like a shield against evil. He found Elellanena sitting motionless on the front porch, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance toward where the woods concealed the river. He approached her cautiously and spoke in the softest, gentlest voice he could manage, suggesting that she should rest, that she should allow others to care for her in her time of grief. She did not look at him when she responded, her voice sounding distant and cracked, as if it was coming from very far away or from someone who had not spoken in a very long time. She said that she had built something that was meant to last forever, something that would transcend the ordinary limits of time and mortality. The preacher, deeply uncomfortable but feeling obligated to offer spiritual counsel, replied carefully that the Lord had taken what she had built, that perhaps it had never been meant to endure. Elellena's head turned sharply at these words, her eyes blazing with something of their old fire for the first time since she had returned from the river. She spat her words at him with venom, declaring that he knew absolutely nothing about what she had built, about the vision she had been pursuing, that she had been trying to save her family, to purify what was dying and weak and make it strong again. The preacher actually took a physical step backward, away from the intensity of her reaction, and he made the sign of the cross over his chest as protection. One night, a young woman from the nearest town who was known for being skeptical of ghost stories and supernatural tales wandered closer to the abandoned property than most people dared to go, partly out of curiosity and partly to prove to her friends that there was nothing to fear. She later told anyone who would listen, and she swore on her immortal soul that she was telling the absolute truth, that she had seen a figure standing beside the massive old oak tree that grew near the house. The figure was that of a tall man with unusually broad shoulders, and his skin appeared to be glistening as if it was still wet from rain or river water. According to her account, he had turned to look directly at her, his eyes meeting hers across the distance, and then he had simply vanished in the instant when she blinked, disappearing as completely as if he had never been there at all. Word of these sightings and strange occurrences spread rapidly throughout the region, and soon people began making deliberate efforts to avoid taking that particular road after darkness had fallen, preferring to take much longer alternate routes rather than risk passing by the cursed property at night. The Whitfield estate was abandoned to nature, left to rot and decay, slowly being swallowed up by wild vines and strangling vegetation and the silence of desolation. By the time the Civil War erupted and swept across Georgia, bringing its own horrors and destructions, the Whitfield mansion had been reduced to little more than a ghost story, a legend whispered around fires, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and obsession. There was one recorded incident during the war when a company of soldiers, not knowing the property's dark history, decided to make camp near the abandoned structure for the night. They built their fires and set up their tents and prepared to rest. But by morning, when the sun rose, every single one of those soldiers had packed up and departed in obvious haste, and they later reported to their commanding officer that they had heard screams coming from within the walls of the empty house. Terrible sounds of anguish and despair that no structure built by human hands should contain. And so the story transformed from history into legend, from documented events into folklore passed down through generations. The people of the region began to say that the widow Elena still walked through the halls of her former home, eternally searching for the daughters she had driven away and destroyed. They said that those daughters, or at least the spirits of them, still called out for the man who had tried to save them from their mother's madness, their voices echoing through the empty rooms and across the abandoned fields. And most disturbingly of all, they said that on certain nights when the river flooded its banks and rose high as it had that terrible night so many years ago, you could still see two shapes standing together at the water's edge, a tall, powerfully built man and a young woman, standing hand in hand, forever looking back toward the house that had damned them all to this eternal repetition of their final moments. No one could say with absolute certainty whether any of these tales were true or simply the products of overactive imaginations and the human need to make sense of tragedy. But the locals knew one thing for certain. If you ever found yourself traveling through that part of Georgia and you came across a road lined with ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss and marked by old weathered white stones half buried in the earth, you should listen very carefully to the sounds around you. And if rain began to fall, and if you heard what sounded like a woman's voice whispering through the thunder, speaking words about blood and mixing and divine purpose, then the wisest course of action was to run, to get as far away from that cursed place as your legs could carry you, and to never look back.